Are you ready for me to start?
Fire away,
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Welcome to City Council. Welcome to the City Council Wards Advisory Committee meeting. I want to start by outlining how this session will proceed. Our first order of business will be to elect a chair and a vice chair for the committee. Once elected, the chair will be responsible for calling on individuals to speak. Please note the meeting is structured in order to gather citizen input for the council from our committee members. Therefore, we will not be taking questions or comments directly from the public during this session. We ask kindly for your cooperation in maintaining order and allowing the meeting to proceed without disruption. Public feedback is highly valued and can be provided during council meetings. Thank you for your understanding, and let's begin. I'm going to call roll. Bev Bishop. Here. Bill Christopher.
Here.
Elise Jarvis.
Here.
Tim Jurgens.
Here.
Or Tom, I'm sorry, Tom. Tom Jurgens, Annie Miller.
Here.
Anita Seitz.
Here.
And Dino Valente.
Present.
Others that are in attendance are Pam Anderson, Greg Graham, Matt Munch, and Abby Fitch. For the clerk's report, I just have a few housekeeping items. If anyone needs to use the restroom, you go out this door, you take your first left and then take your other first left. It's kind of a U around there. And the next meeting that was set tentatively for July 18th will take place, and it will be in the council boardroom. So that is all I have for now. We're gonna go ahead and proceed with the election of chair and vice chair. I'm gonna pass out ballots and you vote for two. So mark two people. And you don't have to rank them. You can X or check mark and then hand your ballots to Pam, who will be tallying. Yeah, does anybody want to, is anybody interested in being chair or want to advocate to?
I'll collect them, I'll tally. My blank tally sheet. Empty ballot box right there.
I love the clerk coming out.
The two highest vote getters with 5 votes is Anita, and with 4 votes is Nicole.
Two.
Oh.
So
You guys have overestimated my competence.
So to keep order, if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and Anita will write your name down in the order that she sees hands raised. And everybody will get a chance to speak before she calls on people again. So it runs very similar to the way our study session runs. And if for some reason Anita cannot preside over the meeting, then Annie will preside over the meeting. So, but we're gonna kick off with a presentation.
Okay.
Please proceed. I mean, for the record, do we want to say that the work session on July 9th, is going to give us a review?
Yeah, and she kicked it off with the
Yeah.
recording as well, so it is, we're on the record. So welcome, Boards Advisory Committee. Congratulations for your appointment. Just talking briefly about what the presentation is going to entail is, and also just so you know, there's 3 screens in here, but you also have the printed version in case it's a little bit difficult to read, so it's a little closer up for you. We're going to talk about the goals and objectives of the committee, a bit of the overview of the legal process and the timeline. This is hopefully going to be helpful context for you, and information to enable you to meet some of those objectives and around the scope of the committee's obligations. What's the legal and professional legal framework and some of the professional practices around drawing districts and creating electoral districts? And then also, you know, moving to an exercise that I think will bring some of that context in after a break, take a break, doing our exercise. Goals, committee goals and objectives. Really, this started with the citizens' vision with the ballot question that was on the November ballot in 2023 to gauge citizen interest in creating city council wards on the ballot. And that passed by unanimous, or not unanimous, majority vote, and to give consensus and direction to the committee to support drawing districts. It went on to go on to a conversation with city council about this process. We had a work session meeting earlier in the spring with city council. And this resulted in the ordinance 4249 that outlined the committee will sit on, and also reflected the citizen input and community input that the council would like to solicit for this topic moving. The objectives are going to be broken down pretty specifically based on what the outline of what the ordinance requires, which we will talk about in the objectives, and will result in recommendation or recommendations to city council from this committee. Those objectives that's outlined by the advisory committee ordinance is to discuss, evaluate, and recommend 2 things. 1, the number of electoral wards for the city. And also to discuss, evaluate, and recommend the number of positions per ward for the city. I'm going to pause there because I think we're going to continue to go back to this document as sort of framing out what we're here for. Does anybody have any questions for that? You know.
How many sections of the city charter are impacted by this? I've done my homework and done some reading. And given Tabor and the single ballot issue, the possibility exists that there could be a question stating that there's a desire to have 17 wards, each with 3 people in it, for a total of 51 councilors, but you could have one vote that changes one part, like we did in 96 when we had a total failure, where you have one section that gets changed. It's like, yeah, we have 51 councilors, but we're still keeping one ward because that's its own section of the charter, and you can't bundle them together. I don't think we can get anywhere until we know that answer.
I think that's a really great question, and which is a great segue to my next slide, which is the legal context and sort of the timeline that we're working under.
We have planned it.
So hopefully that means my brain is logically progressing, which is a minor miracle. So yay for me. But so legal context, starting with both the ballot question, which is the big vision umbrella, right? And then it sort of narrows itself down. And I think maybe that legal process might be illuminate sort of both the role of this committee and then what some of those next steps on the timeline, if this were to be implemented. So going from vision to implementation, Dino, is sort of how I'm framing this timeline out. Starting with the committee. The committee has two very clear objectives: give recommendations, evaluate on those 2 things, the number of districts and the number of positions. But you're absolutely right. There are other things that have to happen before we get to implementation. And so with the wards and advisory advisory committee. The ordinance is the governing document. And then you're a public committee and you operate under the sunshine laws for public meetings, open records laws, and your evaluation will have legal context around things that we will discuss a little bit more detail in a little bit around the United States Constitution and state statutes and case law that sort of gives us our guardrails around drawing districts. There will be a need to have a charter amendment. To Dino's point, the charter must be changed, and to change the charter, it requires a vote of the people. So that is done. A charter amendment is a resolution that's passed by the city council. An evaluation of the charter based on developing and implementing districts will be done. And then typically the election question that goes to the ballot is, shall the charter amendments propose blah, 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 blah? You know, yes or no, is typically what that is. And then the council will determine the scope of those, but the legal advice, and I think it's an appropriate time to introduce our other members of the committee from the legal advice department.
That's actually the name of our.
That'll help inform us around more on that process for the council when it comes to those portions of implementing this if the voters so desire, as well as advising this committee on sort of the legal guardrails, as we talked about around the Constitution and the things that we sort of filter this process through. You guys want to say hi, introduce yourselves?
I'm Greg Graham. I'm the deputy city attorney.
Matthew Munch, I'm one of the assistant city attorneys.
So that charter amendment is what would be proposed to the voters. This committee isn't drafting the charter amendment, but it can, we know that there will be necessary changes to move from all at-large districts to electoral districts and at-large or just districts, and changing the number. The city clerk's office has been working and doing some research on what those charter pieces of the charter might need to be. But that certainly isn't the scope of this committee. Okay. Implementation would be the next phase. That is, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Pam, I just wanted to make sure that that fully answer your question.
It didn't.
Okay. Do you have a follow-up question or do you?
Well,
wanna
while
reserve
I
it for-
completely understand the scope of this committee, and I am also an attorney, as you know, so I'm not dumb. And I have read the charter extensively, and I appreciate your work, Pam. I'm glad we have you at the helm of this. I think our work is folly if we don't understand what we can be recommending to the council. If there's gonna have to be multiple votes that could have multiple consequences, then I think the whole thing is potentially headed down the primrose path to purgatory, quite frankly.
Beautiful alliteration.
It is.
So I want to ask just real quick,
No.
as a follow-up question,
Absolutely.
are there legal considerations that we should consider within the bounds of what we are purview, the two objectives you gave? So are there recommendations that we have that might have more of an impact on the type of ballot question that would go? So I guess if legal feels they need to brief us on the charter interaction, I would ask for that to happen.
Okay, yeah, I think we could definitely consider it. I think the scope itself on the number, and I think this will emerge more than once, what's context and what's a policy recommendation.
Perfect.
So with those two things, and I think setting up what the context is, and I think, Dino, it's fair to say that the charter amendment is, and that being necessary is important context. There will also be, and we'll talk about this in the timeline, multiple points of community input as well on each of those portions. And so I think that's also relevant in setting the context.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions on? Okay. Implementation. So, yes, sir.
I do it. So I was going through the PowerPoints and here are options. I take it this is just a an example list if there's
Correct.
other ones.
And we're gonna look at that in more detail.
Okay.
Yeah, right. For implementation, the charter needs to be amended before moving forward with any implementation. And so there needs to be a majority vote to amend the charter in order to change the district. So while there was a ballot question in 2023, the details of that process and that plan for wards and districts will go again to a vote of the people. Then districts get drawn, and that's where the mapping part comes in. This is where lines within jurisdictions and the number of districts go. And another process for that. I think it's appropriate to start talking about a little bit about timeline, because I know that was a very big discussion with the ordinance. Here we're talking about the ballot question, the council work session I mentioned earlier this spring, the work of the Wards Advisory Committee for 2024. Right now, we have this meeting, another meeting scheduled. I want to particularly talk about the charter amendment election and the timeline and timeframe that dictates. And really, it could be two things, potentially, in the short and a little bit longer term. One, an aspirational goal is to have a charter amendment for this November's election. So that would be a pretty ambitious goal, but not outside of doable with what we know right now. But it is not the be all end all. It has been, the council's has vocalized, but also I believe this is important. It's better to do it well than quickly. Right? And so I think that is the overriding feeling, but with the scope of the committee, and work on potential charter amendment and that council process, a resolution can go and the ballot is certified in early September, just so you know if it was this election. So resolution in front of the council in August, and the ballot gets certified in early September.
I think it's gotta be an ordinance, actually,
An ordinance here, okay.
to change the
Yeah,
charter.
resolution or ordinance.
It's an
It's on the
ordinance.
jurisdiction. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Tom?
Yes, it mentions an election. Is there another, election for the maps, or is it, how are the maps, bounced against the, towards the whole?
That's a great question, Tom. So the maps, if it's a successful election, if it's a successful being defined as majority say, yes, let's amend our charter in order to institute districts, then district mapping happens, and that process takes place. You'll learn a little bit about that because I think it's important context in the decisions and objectives for this committee, and in your evaluation process, pieces of that. And then the decision to adopt the maps for the district is a governance decision by city council. So there would be another opportunity for citizen input for that implementation, as you're seeing in the middle. And then the electoral implementation is regarding the number of districts, the number of counselors, overlapping electoral districts, meaning overlapping terms like you have now. Some run sometime, some run another time. It also would be dependent on who is running, incumbencies versus non-incumbencies, or districts plus at-large districts, which we will do a little bit deeper dive on in a future slide. Yeah.
So this could cost a lot of money, could be very expensive. Is this general fund allocation then that's spent on the group that determines the district mapping and implementation process? Like, it would seem like that would be a lot of consultant hours, or does that happen internally with GIS specialists or something?
I think that's a policy decision for the council and the city manager's office. It can be done a myriad of different ways. I think that ordinance also reflects that there's potential for a committee for mapping. This committee sunsets, but there could be potential for a committee input session. There's also processes with interactive maps for community input. You can do things like town meetings. And all of that, plan, and part of that I have contributed to in sort of a phased plan, depending on charter amendment election and implementation and what the answers to that end up being. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now just talking about what is the thing or redistricting. It is technically a redistricting, but you in City of Westminster, you have one district. Everybody that's at large, so you have a district, just one. Essentially, the terms for wards and districts is interchangeable. So a ward is a district. The district can be a ward or called a district. It's just going quicker. Different governing bodies have it differently in their charters. But the boundaries are established and members of the governing board or the city are elected. So this will, your district lines determine your electoral and how your representation is elected. I think it's important to point out that if districts are implemented, more than one district, two or more, you will have to go through a redistricting process at a minimum every 10 years after the decennial census. And you have to look at population at a minimum population balance. State statute also says no more than 6 unless your home rule charter says something more frequently, like some jurisdictions have. We take a look at it every 4 years. The statute says no more than 6 unless a constitutional amendment creates a reason, a need to redistrict.
Don't buy, rescue,
Questions around?
What?
dog.
Oh,
It's
Okay.
a rescue dog, and
There's
I'm like,
Westminster. There's your city
It's a rescue,
limits and where we're
anyway,
starting. Yeah, I did, for the purposes of an exercise that we're gonna do later this evening, that red line down the middle is your county line as well. I'm sure you're all very familiar, more familiar than I am with it, although I feel like I'm getting a little more familiar. It's exercise, tonight. So really, one of the overriding goals, is evaluation for the objectives, for the 2 questions that we have. An evaluation can have inputs of all sorts of information. I want to frame out what redistricting, some of the legal requirements that you have to place your evaluation in. We will be documenting that as well, because from a legal perspective, it's important to document the criteria with which you evaluate districts. And the focus for this committee is going to be, again, not so much drawing the lines within the districts, but the policy decision, the governing policy decision over the number of districts that make sense given certain criteria or desires or community interest, and the number of individual representation per district. This will translate into a recommendation or recommendations for the council. I thought it would be helpful now to pause here before we dive into drawing districts to talk about those recommendations. One, there could be one consensus recommendation to city council or more, 2 consensus recommendations, or there could be 7, or there could be more than that. So I want to just be clear for this committee that there's no sort of goal or outcome. I do get the sense from individual council members that some consensus would be incredibly helpful in policy decision-making and sort of figuring out community input, but recognizing as well that it may not be unanimous in the number and of districts and how much representation per district. Does anybody have any reflections on that? Just immediate reflections on that? Or questions about that?
Just looking at. My son called up.
Then after calling heavily. Okay,
So
sorry.
you
I'll
talk
write my
you
notes.
talk about preserving precinct boundaries, there's about roughly 42 precincts. Plus, no, a little bit more than that, there's some farther south, probably about 50. So if we draw districts that are 4 or 6 within Westminster, it might be difficult if you want to draw some compactness to get them perfectly even because we're restricted by precincts. boundaries.
Yeah, so we're gonna do a little bit of a dive on that. You're absolutely right in the principles and criteria with which we need to abide by, either legally or sort of non-constitutional principles, which we'll go through here. And precinct lines is one of them, because our electoral districts following precinct lines is important. It'll play a larger role in the next implementation phase of drawing the internal, just like the maps within the external districts, right? And where those district lines go. But you're honing in on exactly one of the key principles, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, which is equal population. And our exercise tonight is going to deal with that directly. Elise.
So when you're doing the population, are we only looking at people 18 plus that are the voting population, or is it the whole entire population that live in Westminster?
That is a wonderful question. You guys have great instincts for this, by the way. I can tell already. So population balance means the census population of the residents, the people within the city of Westminster. It is not electoral population or voters, because representation does not only represent the voters. You represent more than just the voters.
Okay.
And that's established in one person, one vote. And so, and the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. So the 14th Amendment says equal representation, not equal voting representation. And so that's the status. We're gonna go into that a little bit more detail.
Okay.
Were these compiled in any particular order? Like, is there some preference ordering here?
So the two that, the ones that are towards the top are a little bit more on the legal framework versus the non-constitutional provisions. We're gonna do a little bit dive into them, but so population balanced, and racial equality are two of the US constitutional provisions that are required by law. And so those are going to be a little bit of a higher requirement. So Federal Voting Rights Act, meaning you do no harm in drawing your districts. And we'll talk in more detail about what that can look like. And what our legal counsel is certainly going to tell us we need to avoid around legal liability and drawing districts at that point. Preserve electoral district lines. So electoral district lines is what you were talking about, Tom, regarding precincts. So we have electoral precincts, you coordinate your elections. So larger electoral lines like county line is going to be one that we're gonna do an exercise on tonight that I think will give us some important context around the policy question. But whether or not they're legal or community of interest lines can be debated unless it's within a district. So precinct lines is within. County lines, for example, is an external line that goes through the jurisdiction and so may have less of a legal provision and more of a community of interest provision. Compactness, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but compactness means you're not doing the octopus district, right? And you're not severing any portion of the district in its entirety. And contiguity is the severance part. Preserve communities of mutual interest. This is a non-constitutional provision that also can indicate anything from cultural to economic interest, political interest, or otherwise. We'll talk a little bit about that more, and then incumbent residency and whether or not that applies for nonpartisan municipal districts. Evaluated a little bit more. Actually, I'd like to talk about incumbent residency now. So So the legal framework does talk about preserving incumbent residency with respect to federal and state races and county races, so electoral districts. Municipal races are a little bit different with respect to the legal framework of this. And when I talk about incumbent residency, when you're drawing the internal lines for districts, the impact on an incumbent, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's called hijacking or kidnapping an incumbent by how you draw their lines, is influenced legally by residency requirements for municipalities. So a lot of home rule jurisdictions require residency, and so that has an impact. And there's less case law on whether or not that's a good or bad thing. But I do think that it can be mitigated by things like at-large districts. So we can talk about that.
I would think also grandfathering people who are presently in office would take care of that too.
What do you mean by grandfather?
Yeah, if somebody is elected, not out of office. A
Yeah.
certain way.
Around
So
the,
once that person passed their term of office, then that's a different thing.
yeah. I think you're honing right in on that incumbent question. So going into a little bit more detail on each of these principles, balancing population is really, particularly for nonpartisan municipal districts, is one of the strongest, most overriding criteria with which we need to abide by. It's a constitutional context. As I said, the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, the equal protection of that, one person, one vote, means that our goal is as equal population as possible. Case law has established a standard for that, and the standard is math. I'm a history major, but luckily I've done this once or twice, is the deviation from the ideal population. So if you have a certain number of districts, let's say 2, you decided into 2 districts. Half of your population, so 50% and 50%, your ideal, 50% is your ideal district. And where you draw those lines and where they end up landing population is the deviation. So how far away from that ideal district number are you? And case law tells us that we want to be less than 10%. There are some states that, and for non-municipal districts, that threshold for Colorado is less than 10, I think it's 3%, 4%. It's 4 or 5% now. Washington is 1%, so they have to be very, very close in population. So when we are looking at those populations, we're going to look at some examples for deviation. That is the goal, and that is the test that you will be measured against when you're drawing those district lines, those internal lines. I do think this number will be important context in the number of districts as well, based on different values that the committee might hold.
Mr. Christopher.
Gee, thank you. Question, Pam. What's the source of the less than 10% rule for Colorado? Where did we look that up? Is there such?
So I would defer to my attorneys, but the less than 10% is the source in case law based on the 14th Amendment.
Thank you.
Okay. There could be additional case law for legislative districts that has a narrower scope, so less than 5%, Washington's less than 1. So there would be additional law. The state of Colorado does not have a threshold dictated in statute for municipal districts. So this is what we have to go on. Great question. And here is what we were talking about earlier, Jarvis, around the voting age population. We are taking the total population from the census numbers, not the citizens voting age population. It's been particularly called out that we are drawing districts based on census numbers and the total population. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
So I'm going to perseverate on my question. I am a math guy, and I do respect history a lot because what we did in 96 was a mess. We changed from where the mayor was elected from amongst city councilors and the mayor pro tem to an elected mayor, but we failed wards. To me, all of this seems academic and is a cart a year ahead of a horse. Because unless council says we want to put a question on the ballot to change from that charter amendment, and maybe legal can help me and tell me, or charter, somewhere in the charter in the election section, is it 3.01? That says the city shall be comprised of one ward. Am I close to correct?
That's right. That's accurate.
Okay, and then there's another section of the charter that spells out how many members for the ward.
Yes.
So it would seem to me that those are really the two things we need to consider, because those go to a vote of the people. And if the people don't pass it, it doesn't matter if we're talking about compactness or ethnic groups or how many people. Do we want more than one ward, which is what we charter wise, which is our city constitution, have now? And if the answer to that is yes, how do we want them to be? I think all of this is putting the paint on the house before you have the structure. And I have some strong opinions in my head on what I'd like to see, but I don't think it goes anywhere without those two votes of the people or a charter convention that brings together a committee to redo the entire charter. And I don't think we can do anything else. I don't think anything can be changed by a ward. I don't think it matters if we have 72 precincts in Adams County and 49 in Jefferson County, and this many of this population, that many of that population. The sovereign vote of the people is what controls everything. Until we can get to that point, I don't think we have a discussion.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm not sure that every committee member lands where you are, but I think that's helpful to know, Tina. I also think that there are those that have an attorney background that do a deep dive on that sort of thing, and there are others that need more contextual. And I think
That's
that
fair.
the deeper context is important in order to come to a policy recommendation of exactly what you're talking about, whether or not there should be a movement to more wards than one and the larger number. And what council has said in their ordinance is they're looking for citizen input on those two questions. And so this is, I think, relevant, in my experience, relevant context to help you inform your discussion and evaluation.
I think it's very relevant. The smaller your wards, you choose to have multiple wards, the more difficult it is to experience. But that's not saying that I believe that wards are a bad thing. I'm saying that that's a math thing right there.
So we are going to talk a little bit more about the criteria and the evaluation part, because I think it is helpful, in my professional opinion, I think it's helpful in context. We're also going to do an exercise that may illustrate, Tom, exactly what you're talking about around a key policy decision that may inform the number of districts. And this is just on a few of the key principles around drawing districts. And then the discussion can move towards what other context would be helpful. Also, where are we at, I think, is another piece, and that'll be the exercise after our break. Okay. So population is a very, very important piece of drawing districts, and I would argue for nonpartisan municipal districts, the most impactful one in determining the number of districts. Not necessarily amount of representation, but where those, what equal districts might look like and how that interacts with the number, for the math people in the room. Okay. Some more context for you. The population numbers come from the 2020 census. Now, these numbers do get updated. They're aged periodically. So we are going to be working tonight on 2022 updated numbers from the census around population. I do want to say, when you look at measures like this, what we know is we're taking a snapshot, like we're standing in a river of population. What we know is populations are fluid. They move in and out. But this process is around the criteria based on these snapshots. And the data that we're using is the 2020 census. This map is an example of the congressional gains or losses of the number of districts based on population that we saw out of 2020 and some of the sources for that data information. It's just context. Another piece around equal population is the constitutional provision around the Voting Rights Act. And the notion here in the state that has been upheld in case law is do no harm with respect to racial demographics and voting rights. And so this is around cracking or packing districts in order to dilute or concentrate certain interests, racial interests. And these are just visual representations of that for different interests. So red and blue indicate, could indicate party, but we're talking about nonpartisan district. But different racial things and diluting that. If you draw a line that has an argument for dilution based on the internal district lines, you could put your plan at risk at legal liability. And there's a United States constitutional provision that says you really shouldn't be doing that. Creating residential electoral districts, the notion of going from all at large to wards has some values attached to it. As presented to City Council, and I know a lot of the community discussions around representation and more geographic district representation than at large, there is a required dispersion of representation by individual geographic districts that you may or may not have based on electoral outcomes and who decides to run. Is your districts can be more geographically homogeneous. In that respect, there are political implications of drawing districts as well. For example, candidates that have a smaller subset of population with which to represent have a potentially lower political entry fee to representing that district. Even just in sweat equity, I've been a candidate multiple times. Walking door to door in a district, when I was a municipal clerk, I could walk every door in my jurisdiction. When I ran for Secretary of State, I couldn't really do that myself. And so when you have the smaller districts, the grassroots individual candidate investment has a little bit of a lower entry cost. And so that's some of the things that have been discussed around wards. And have an impact in voting rights regarding communities of interest as well. Are there cultural communities of interest that is a criteria that you may want to consider? The answer doesn't necessarily have to be yes or no. It's just food for thought.
I'm sorry, Tina.
So you're talking about compactness and running and lower cost. You can have a ward where you're required to live in the ward, but run at large for the totality of the municipality, correct?
Rent, that would be one option.
Which is something I think is awesome.
Sorry. So the county I reside in is like that for commissioner districts would be one example.
That's state
We
statute.
have that in Adams County.
Yeah. This is another example of the dilution or of racial or political interest, or communities of interest. Cracking and packing of voters is what we call it in the biz. And that is something that gets pretty strict scrutiny by the courts, particularly around racial cracking or packing. Parties less relevant with respect to nonpartisan electoral offices, for sure. Another concept that I wanted to reaffirm is hijacking or kidnapping, drawing electoral representatives out of the district, or kidnapping when the redistricting of the incumbents end up in, like, you pick them up on the edge, but really they have a whole new constituency. So they're technically in the same district, but the constituency has significantly changed, and that is what we refer to as kidnapping.
Mr. Christopher.
If I might ask Pam, in Westminster, we have different minorities that live in different parts of the city. And so how do you handle that when you're drawing, say, three wards? But yet, let's take Asian descent. They tend to live in one part of town. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so some evaluation that can be done on drawing, that might be a little bit more, important context, but more in the implementation phase of drawing maps, Bill, but you use the same census data. The American Community Survey is a very stable survey instrument that used through the census, and it gets updated regularly. And you can draw overlays through GIS to say, where do you have concentrations of different types of demographic populations? And so the criteria and the evaluation we do, where are they? And ensuring that you're not drawing a line that creates harm to that particular community. And how dense or different in population is that community? Because you might have a pretty good heat map of a certain criteria, but the difference is really, it's your scale, right? If the difference is less than 1%, or, the scale is also important.
Does the less than 10% deviation apply as far as
It is,
minorities are
it's a little
concerned?
bit of a different evaluation. It's more on the do no harm, not the exact numbers.
Okay,
So it's less driven by the number.
thank you.
I think it's a fair thing.
So when the Supreme Court, and correct me if I'm interpreting that last legislation on this differently, but the different algorithms that were proposed for checking the percentages
Mhm.
were like that, a deviation off that mean again. So it wasn't population deviation, it was deviation by race, ethnicity, which on census is actually really hard to determine because they're separate items. So if you try to cluster those, it's hard to do that algorithm effectively. And then they look at it by Republican, Democrat, typically the party affiliation. And it's rough estimates because it only tracks voters. So for this population piece, that's a good question on this of saying, if you're looking total population, census data looks pretty different when you try to determine if it's been cracking, packing, or stacking in these cases. So getting that and then trying to differentiate across VRA and the different parts of legislation, which should be rank ordered in that outcome. So is a racial interest more or less important than packing or stacking a political interest? So last time the court heard the case, they looked at 3 different ways of thinking about those algorithms. And that's when they reworked their interpretation of VRA, the Voting Rights Act. And so when that was last taken up, kind of what we see is that out of this process, to an extent, they really try to heavily weight population more than they would weight racial or political or other kinds of deviations from the algorithm. So if you think about the math you do behind that, you would weight population difference more than you would weight the part of the calculation around racial, political, or other kinds of deviations. I think for us, to your point too, Dino, we're just saying we're recommending a number to council for charter change. We don't have to worry about these things as this group in particular. So some of this is kind of for us, like probably in the weeds, because ultimately, like, we get to ship that off to someone else's decision after we meet a few times. And so I think there's pretty good evidence of like the algorithms and what would be the outcome of that. And there's a couple ways that council could review it, or the consultants could review it, or, you could think about it. But then the question becomes, like, if there are significant clusters, they'll have to decide if race ethnicity is more important than preserving political interest. And that's a political decision. That's a council and, vote decision. So that's one of those things that for us in this group, luckily, we can kind of like set that aside.
Not our worry.
I really appreciate, for those listening at home, you all realize how lucky we are to have Annie Miller serving on this committee right now, and appreciate that background. I would say, and not to disagree with anything you said, the context is still valuable.
Mhm.
So when we recognize that there are those, different communities of concern, right? And it helps us to figure out, is that number, I think you said 57, or is it 5, right? Like, you were joking, I think, with how many. Oh, I can't remember what number you said off. the top of your-
17 with 3 per, that's 51.
okay.
Math guy here.
Okay. Or, are there, looking at just broad strokes, does that help us with what the number is? Which then helps inform council, and then it helps inform the voter. Are they comfortable with a charter amendment that reflects that number? And I do hear you, Mr. Valente, about like the chicken and the egg of how this happens, but the voters have decided we're gonna start chicken instead of starting egg, and the council decided this process. So I think here we are, and
Yeah.
I do appreciate you doing this, because I think it's really
Yeah.
helpful
Well,
context.
I think that was incredibly helpful too. I would add that the political context, I think, is weighted lower for nonpartisan elected representatives.
Yes.
So when you're looking at criteria when drawing a map, I think you're right. When you asked when I put those up, are they in any certain order? That's absolutely the correct concept. I think legal for you guys, right, as the priority with respect to the number, and the number of districts for sure. And that is a math problem, number and population. We're going to do an exercise that sort of asks a policy question around that. So thank you for that. That was great.
No, I would just say, like, I think when I talk about this stuff, a lot of times I'll think about like, this is legal interpretations or definitions by an algorithm. And the question we do ask ourselves on this committee is like, what does fair representation look like conceptually? And some of that language is around like multi-member districts. So like our at-large, where we have multiple people in one geographic region that can reflect racial or political interests differently. So like that's, one right now, big old district of that representation versus like what would look better for us as citizens to feel represented appropriately. And I try to keep like those two things in mind as a citizen on this group, which is that like tension between what is fair representation when we make this proposal to our peers who we live next to and who we see have different backgrounds and different goals and different ideas versus the idea of what we would, what another group is going to implement around like, if I were to just look at someone and not know them, I can see visually that they think they might vote this way, but they may not vote that way. Like, I can't know their interests. I know what my neighbors would like. And so I think I'm trying to heavily think about like, what would it mean to be fairly represented in the conversation and what could that look like to do it better versus thinking about like some of the like mathematical components and like what would feel good in a city to feel like there were enough people on a city council that looked like our whole population.
I think that's right. And I think to layer onto that a little bit of nuance for nonpartisan districts, when talking about fairness, what often comes up is, if not using party participation or voters as a criteria for nonpartisan districts, one, because it doesn't make sense, and two, the largest group of voters does not align with a party registration. So where are you gonna draw the line for the unaffiliated person? For a nonpartisan district? So I think, fairness might have some context or apply some context there, or there has been conversation. Another thing that I would mention is one of the criteria that is not applied for local jurisdictions. Necessarily, there's not case law on this, but is specifically applied for federal and state is competitiveness, which applies into electoral outcome, which is not a criteria for municipal districts. So I think that is one of the things, Annie, like you were saying, that we probably take off the table for consideration from a contextual point.
Mr. Valente.
Yes, Ms. Sights, thank you. Ultimately, though, to reflect back on what you're saying, based upon the vote of the people last year, there's nothing binding.
Exactly.
This council can take a recommendation, say, okay, we studied it, we hired a consultant, we had a committee, fit, and throw it out the window.
It's an advisory committee.
And
That's
then,
right.
and the council doesn't have to do anything. They don't have to make a single change. There's nothing binding them to make a change, correct?
I would defer to my attorneys, but I think they have an ordinance that says they want to consider recommendations for a plan.
I think that it
So-
said that the ballot measure said we shall bring to the people. I think that we have, that the city council is obligated to bring something. But you're right, the city council is, at the end of the day, the one responsive to the voters. They can ignore what, that they can do what they want to at the end of the day. This is an advisory board.
And there was like the timeline restriction on that, which I should have mentioned, was 2026, which gives us 2 bites at the governance apple, right? This election and this election. Please.
Yeah, it was 2026.
Yes.
So we have to,
26.
yeah, 2026 that the city was supposed to make those changes.
It's supposed to, is that, the city is supposed to propose something to the voters.
Propose a system.
Yeah.
From geographic.
Right,
ward
something-
Rather than at large. So to your point, though, they could say, we want to propose continuing at large in total. That could be the proposal.
But that's by the council ordinance of this spring, not by the sovereign vote of the people last year.
Indeed.
Sorry, Anita.
I would like to let Elise speak real quick. I appreciate her.
So, right, so this election year, something has to be on the ballot.
No, this election year or next election, year, something has to be about before 2026.
Council has a choice.
All right, I thought there was something that was supposed to be on the ballot this year that we either came to something to present on this ballot. If the committee couldn't come to something that we could present to council, council could then go to city staff and request city staff to come up with something that could be presented on the ballot for the city of the residents.
That may well be what they do. But that's not obligated by that's not what was obligated to them by the,
Let
What
me
was
find
submitted
that.
to the vote of the
It's,
people
hold
did
on,
not
where's
require
the-
that.
It's
The
in there,
ballot
the
question-
residents, it's in their ordinance that they presented, 429, I don't have. I don't
Or
have-
maybe the ordinance establishing this board.
Thank you. Let me see where it's written.
They can reconstitute the committee in 2025 to provide input on ward/district boundaries. Is that the part, section 2,
So
part
maybe-
C?
Going back to this timeline, it might be a little bit helpful. So the charter amendment aspirationally, that's an election in 2024, so November, or 2025. In order to meet the 2026 ballot question. District mapping, if it's this November, and the charter amendment says, yes, we will go with this district plan that council proposes on the number of districts. That implementation process, then, the charter amendment is adopted. The implementation process would be mapping where those lines go within the city for the number of districts that the voters approve. And that can happen in early spring 2025 or at the latest, early spring 2026. And the reason why it's the latest, early spring 2026, because the final piece of implementation is putting it into the electoral system. That's the precincting and districting that places the voters in their appropriate district for elections, which will be held, your first implementation election will be held in November of 2026. Or
I'm just gonna go around the horn here and see if anybody has questions or follow-up comments based off of that. Anyone? Or from the legal team? Any? Clarifying?
Something I think you might just clarify this. I hope if I'm not getting ahead of you.
please, yeah.
So first, you're absolutely right. There does need, before any of this districting, redistricting can happen, there has to be a question about, do we change the charter or not? Now, one point of confusion that might be is that there is you're absolutely right, there is a single subject requirement for these things. That's a single subject requirement, not a single section requirement. Frequently, there are charter and ordinance changes that amend multiple sections of the charter or the code. So long as they are affecting the same subject, it can be done in one question. So yes, you're absolutely right. There are multiple areas of the charter that would have to be amended in order to implement whatever the city council decides to do, but it is one question. So you wouldn't have to submit multiple charter questions to people, just one, so long as it's on the same subject. Then if the people then decide to do that, the people can decide no. And then there we go, we're back to at large, we stay doing what we're doing. If people say yes, that is one, after we have amended the charter, now have these districts, which can be done in any number of different ways, then all of this has to take place. I apologize if everyone already knew that, but I felt like maybe that was a source of confusion.
It was helpful.
I feel like it was very helpful. Thank you.
Now I will sit back and
I looked at you and asked for legal clarification, so I appreciate it. All right.
I put an asterisk by helpful clarification.
Tom,
Talk about electoral implementation, are you talking about fall of 26, aren't our elections in odd years?
So electoral implementation will be multi-phase, right? It'll be multi-phase because of potentially staggered terms and term limits and how many districts and how many people within those districts. So that would be mapped out once the charter on the number and the number of seats.
so just for the record, I just want to allow Elise to point out what she saw in the ordinance that the council just passed this March, which basically said that they will make a recommendation by ballot referral ordinance in the 2024 general election ballot. But if the council does not approve a submitted ward system for referral in the 2024 ballot, the council may instruct city staff to bring forward an alternate ballot proposal for voter consideration, or may be able to table the question until a later time. So I think that's why that portion is why. it could
Okay,
be
so then
punted to
nothing
2020
would be on the ballot at all.
For 2024. So it gives
Gotcha.
some degrees of freedom for the council to maybe take it slow and really be,
There are
yeah,
doors.
yeah, they have degrees of freedom in how they respond to our recommendations.
Gotcha.
Wonderful. Should we check in on, does anyone need a bio break, or are we at a point?
Yeah, let me, here, it's done.
Okay,
Before our break. so
Okay.
Depending, but anytime you want to break, I think this is a work session, so we can take break. Okay, so the other principles we can, quickly go over, because these certainly will be of less concern for this committee, is contiguity, right? So in other words, you can't have islands in your district, compactness. This is the typical sort of quote gerrymander gerrymandered district one that goes and gets, that could be an example of hijacking, kidnapping, and then existing or natural boundaries, so major streets and roads, rivers. I like to use the particularly our mountain jurisdictions, that, or call it, they have a major river that runs, through their jurisdictions. Those can be considerations for drawing those districts at that next phase.
Thank you. Yes. Compactness. You look at no. That is the Jefferson County side of Westminster, that white chunk.
Fair point. Yes.
The northern part of Jeffco Westminster and the southern part of Jeffco Westminster are not contiguous. Not even through Sheridan. So,
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
horrible.
that's a
Yeah.
good
and it goes back to before any of you were here. It goes back to old farmers who hated each other and didn't want their kids going to certain schools in certain districts because their neighbor that they hated was on the school board. It goes back before all of that. You're talking 80, 90 years.
Stations were okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Bet.
Yes, and when Bertha Hyde was superintendent over all she spied.
Yeah.
But that's what we have, that big red chunk in that no is Arvada piercing through Westminster. So if you're talking about compactness at some point, thinking about multiple districts, how does one navigate that? What kind of recommendations are there for such navigation?
Yeah, well, I think.
In keeping communities of interest, ethnic minority communities, district boundary lines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Supreme Court rulings. How does one do that when you can't even throw a rock to your other neighbor without going through another county?
Yeah, I think Annie was honing in on it a little bit in her remarks. That you have things that are just is, right? And that may have in sort of the ranking of evaluation and the criteria, where if your jurisdiction is shaped like that, you're gonna have
It literally
limitations.
is.
Yeah, you're gonna have limitations on compactness, which would be exhibit A in any legal, right? I mean, it is something that would be taken into account, right? And it just is. You are given certain boundaries to use as your municipality. That is the assumption you start with. And so you start with certain assumptions, and those criteria go up and down based on what those assumptions are. These are nonpartisan offices. Equal population is always going to be the number one criteria at the top because of the one person, one vote legally. And then there are other things that can be considerations, but may not be necessary for you.
I think that, presently we are dealing with boundaries, but something that will have some effect that we think about, because the number of wards we choose will have an effect on how easy that is. In terms of boundaries, I think the boundaries between Adams County and Jefferson County, that boundary should be just not worried about, because that's gonna cause normal funds to try to respect that.
You must be my spirit animal, because you are just preempting my exercise later a little bit. I think you're gonna enjoy it.
Spoiler alert.
Tom's gonna get a gold star.
So I just wanted to provide some context that the council heard. You could go back and listen to that work session if you're interested. But there is a chart that I provided around governance of councils that CML has. And there's a little, this is just a little piece, a screenshot of it, but it's in your materials. And I extracted, regional, Front Range, all, of the pertinent and what I see as relevant governance examples that you could apply. And I think there's a couple of trends that emerge with this data. One is for your population, there's only one other even close, and that's Boulder. size population was all at large. In the state. It's not just in the Front Range, in the state. So that is less common. Another trend and emerging is the hybrid model of districts and at-large members. That is also a popular, common trend around governance that I'd like to point out as well. But there's a list there. There's source information with even more municipalities if you're interested. I think I might have linked to it. I can, but to make it a little bit more applicable to what you are looking at. And I also think that it's interesting to see the average population per district where there are districts, right? How many people are individual electoral members, representatives representing? Again, in Boulder and Westminster, that's a lot in the context of every other municipality in Colorado.
Tom,
So the citizens gave us, the council, and then through the council, us, a direction to say they wanted board representation. And I walked around the city, talked to a lot of people, and there are parts of the city that feel totally like I'm not represented.
Mhm.
So I think the important thing is to make sure our districts, and this is the number that we choose, aren't so large yet that perception continues. We need to make sure that when we look at average population for district, in my opinion, it should be on the low end of what we see.
Okay, so we're gonna do a facilitated workshop after the break, but if there's any emerging questions or anything, here's your chance. We'll always have time to go back to them as well. So if you think of something and want to jot it down, we'll always stop and pause for any Q&A. This was just sort of an overview of where we're at, some timeline structure, as well as some context and helpful comments from the committee around history and legal framework. We'll take a break and then we're gonna do some activities. I do wanna point out, has anybody used Slido on their phone? It's sort of a little polling.
like Mentimeter, but it's. just
Yeah,
different.
it's like, it's a
Okay.
different, it's
Okay.
a different brand.
I haven't used it.
So when we're doing an activity, we can either do Post-it notes, but if you like phone sort of polling stuff, there will be slides. If you want to download the app to your phone, it'll just pop up the survey on your phone and you can respond there, or we'll put it on a Post-it note. So you have choices. If you go to slido.com or just look in your app store for Slido, I just wanted to mention that if you wanted to get ahead on it.
I have a question. So I just am noting that I kind of hear two assumptions kind of baked into this, and one is that I haven't heard if like the structure of the electoral process for the mayor is included in this. And two, an assumption around the nonpartisan nature of municipal elections, like, I mean, most of the literature would suggest that like it's actually not nonpartisan, even when you try to say it is. Because people's yard signs just sit
Amen.
right next to each other and you're like, oh, oh, I guess I know that, you know. So I'm curious if those are two things that are intended to be on the in the conversation, because if I want to capture the idea of representation, our electoral institutions, like how we structure the districts, is at much as play as how you like write the informal rules around nonpartisan, you know, that piece and mayoral pieces of this. Like, I just want to be sure I understand like what, if those two things are in the conversation, because this would be changing the electoral the subject is changing the electoral process.
Annie, I think that's a good question. I didn't mean to imply that it's off the table. I wanted to provide context for a fairness question. Like there may be a community that says if you draw it by voter registration, for example, data instead of population data, that there may be a perception of fairness issue with unaffiliated voters. Not that political context should be off the table, but I could share with you with my experience that political context in municipal districts is unusual. Is more on the unusual side when they're considering their districts in the end. So I think the criteria falls in importance in that process. But it is the committee's decision on what criteria they want to evaluate.
But I'm asking in what we propose, are we supposed to assume that nonpartisanship stays and is not part of the subject of the electoral process? And then are we supposed to assume that the mayoral electoral process remains exactly the same and isn't part of deciding between wards and at large?
So the way the way the ordinance reads is that the mayor would still be elected at large. So that's the call.
Okay,
So that's the first thing. And I would say with respect to partisanship question, drawing line, or you're not drawing lines, you're not drawing maps, you're
Right.
just deciding the number of wards and how many representatives from each ward or at large. So that doesn't come into play at this point.
yeah, no, it's just a
Well, there's
outcome
a
of
letter.
representation is just the electoral question of like, if we have if you have more at-large members, you get larger scope of ideology across each member of your district versus if it's drawn as only single member districts with the one at-large electoral mayor, then you're more likely to have truncated scope of ideology in your electors. And so I'm asking that question of like, as we weigh multi-member districts, single member districts, or like numbers, to me, that is part of why I'm asking that question, or that's the back part of that question.
You can certainly, I mean, that's something absolutely you can consider when trying to make a determination about your recommendation of how many wards there should be. So absolutely, that's on the table as one of any number of factors you are at liberty to consider. Changing to a partisan election, I think is a little bit outside, so that the scope here is pretty limited. How many wards should there be? And you can consider whatever you want to make that decision. If you fundamentally change the process of the city, for instance, right now, the mayor is elected at large, and the mayor is a fundamentally different office than the office of city council member. They're not bound by the same term limit. It's a separate office. To take the mayor and say, now the mayor shall be elected, that would be a change to the electoral process that is not in the scope of what was given here. Similarly, enacting partisan elections where now there have to be primaries, things like that, that would also be a change in the scope beyond what was signed by the city council.
And just to dovetail, just
Say again?
They're not
They're-
partisan.
Yeah, they're nonpartisan.
Mhm.
Any city council people are not supposed to be partisan.
Not supposed to be.
I think there's,
Exactly.
I think you need to, we need to understand that there's a difference between being registered with a political party or otherwise and the idea of nonpartisan elections. Because people can run as whatever they're affiliated with and say, I'm a Republican, looking for your vote in Ward 2.
And they can act as partisan as they care to in the way we use the term.
But there are no primaries to have.
Right.
There's no
you
R
know.
next to their name on the ballot.
Right.
Right.
That's really what we mean by nonpartisan elections. There's no primary, no
I'll let you go
primaries.
right after Dino.
And can I ask just to clarify, when you say the impact at large versus district only, it's if you only have districts here and their representation versus where they reside? I just want to, okay, so it's just how
Residency,
representative are they?
so, yeah, so if you cut the pie, right? When you cut the pie and say one person gets elected from that part of the pie, you're more likely to pack your ideological representation than if you have multi-member districts. So say you just do it like this on that circle. Sure, there's only two. And then you have 4 people in each versus in another one where you cut 8 slices of pie. in that one, you're more likely to have larger variation on your ideological, not partisan, but ideological spectrum, which here would be reflected as partisanship, probably.
We correspond with partisanship.
Sure, yeah. So in that scenario where you have some more at-large districts with multiple members elected, you get less of a representation outcome for what you talked about earlier, which is somebody saying, I don't feel represented by who I can elect. So when you get a 1-1-1-1-1, you could live in that place forever and never feel like you were represented because there was no ideological scope.
I'd like to speak to this.
Yeah.
Dino's up.
Sorry.
You can, you did send, are you okay, Dina? Allow him to, yeah.
So you said that when you had small districts with single people in there, it becomes more ideological uniform as opposed to variety, is that correct?
The likelihood to have a larger scope of ideological difference is higher when you have multi-member districts. So more people in a district than when you geographically create a district that only has one representative.
So I'd love to find the references that
Sure,
I've heard about that before.
yep, I can send you.
But certainly, the argument from a given neighborhood saying they are not represented is just as valid when there's at-large districts. They never have neighborhoods from their area because other parts of the city. So as much as this one person per member district. One thing that we can look at, we looked at our neighbor to our East Thornton, they have 4 districts. And there's 2 representatives each. That could mitigate some.
Or the example of two at large.
Some ways to do it.
Another variation. With no judgment on good or bad or whatever, it's just the numbers, right?
Right.
How you slice a pie.
But I think it's a really great conversation about how those numbers and how that pie is sliced impacts how folks are represented, the types of candidates that might come out of it, the level of, really regionally specific, like issue candidates versus a little bit more broad appeal. So I think this is all very helpful conversation.
And the cost to run, right? When you're talking about knocking on doors, like if I want to run from a neighborhood and I live somewhere that's a lower socioeconomic neighborhood, like how would I run in all at-large districts? Because I could never afford to even be a candidate to get my name out there or anything.
I forget many times, it's actually harder to vote for a city council position. Because the number of doors you have to touch versus a house
Paper.
system.
Yep.
Which is. a
And who's
stretch.
gonna pay for those flyers?
Right. And what happens then is that then the amount of money you get that determines whether or not.
It comes with a whole other host of
Right.
issues.
Conversations.
I just want to make sure that we get to Dina's question too.
Well, I don't see money as the issue. We have a current city councilor who spent $0.00 and won a seat very handily. So I think it's possible. I'm just gonna throw it right out there because that's the kind of person I am. I favor 3. My recommendation, since we can have unlimited, and we probably will not come to a consensus in this group, my recommendation is going to be for 3 wards, 2 people per ward, and they have to run at large through the whole city. I
Okay,
don't
well, we
like,
have
I've
an
never
example.
liked the notion of you only run in your ward. I find it exactly what Andy is saying. It's limiting, but maybe not the point she was trying to make. It's limiting, you become myopic, you become only responsive to what is happening in your little narrow part of the world, and you do not care about the rest of the city as a whole. You are there to represent everybody. I just think it should work like the commission districts, which work very well in the state of Colorado. You have to live in a district to run for the district, but you run at large and you represent the entirety of that county.
And so, thank you, Dina, for getting us started on our last thing to
I've always been the dessert first kid.
You're gonna mess up the agenda, Dino.
Put it up later. Yes, the-
No, if you want to, I will record whatever you'd like to say.
Yeah, why don't you?
Well, and I think it would be fair for those that aren't ready to voice a position that this is non-binding, right? At the end of this, you may start in one place and given context and conversation and debate, you may end up in a different place. And so this is not something we're gonna hold you to, except for Dino. So I think it's important to put that out there. You are not ascribing to something and then, going to the mattresses. This is a facilitated discussion. How about that?
Well, I don't have anything specific besides what Dino had here, but 4 to 6 wards is fine with me. But one thing I think is not a good idea is even if you break into the wards, if you have the electorate be the entire city. Because what you have then is potentially people that live in a part of the parts of the district get essentially elected by people in other parts of the city and we see that. So so in other words, if you do make wards, the electorate for that ward is the people within that,
So,
within that
so
ward.
whatever that number is, it's the one on the upper left, whatever number per.
Well, you can have two people, you can have two people in the ward.
But you are
the
living there.
people that vote for the people within a ward must be only the people within the ward. I think that's important. Otherwise, people again feel disenfranchised because people outside their ward are determining who represents them.
So we have very different initial anchor points in this conversation. But I think that's why we're all at this table. So I'm excited to continue the conversation. Anything else before we go to break?
Well, I'll go ahead
Yeah.
and just mix it up a little more.
Okay.
Well, if you read my column in the window, you would already know what I'm gonna say, because I've been at this for about 5 years now. As far as seeing a need to change how council people are elected. I believe 3 wards, and there's 3 school districts, and common interest in the community, I think, is important. It didn't get a lot of weight from what Pam was saying, but in my book, that's important, community of interest. And I'm especially thinking of the southern part of the city when I say that. So I would favor 3 wards, 1 person from each ward, and 3 at large. And I say that because, and Dino touched on it with his term myopic. I've seen it time and time again in Thornton, in North Glen, and Arvada, where there is a lot of myopic thinking within those council wards. That's not good, in my opinion. You need the big picture at the same time as you need effective representation. And there's been a hunger for effective representation and communications. I think it's a key point, is the communications part when you're talking wards. My council member, and council would always say, we represent all the city. Well, that sounds good. I'm not sure it really worked, but sounded good. Anyway, to bring it to closure, 3 wards, 1 each from each ward, and 3 at large. And I would have, picking up on Tom's kind of versus Dino, I very much favor the person has to live in the ward and be elected only in the ward. I think that's what people are hungry for in Westminster. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
My peripheral vision, I'm like gonna have to get something better here. Yes, Elise.
3 wards, 2 each, they have to live in the ward, is what mine is.
No at large?
3 wards, 2 each, oh, mayor's at large,
Oh, no,
But
no,
that's-
okay.
yeah, no at large, they have to live in the ward.
All right. Does anyone else have kind of a
Different
pocket
model?
proposal before there's
Conversations we can go-
Okay, I'm just gonna lay my cards on the table that I really want to have the conversation before I submit a proposal, go through the exercises and really hear. I appreciate all of you sharing your perspectives and don't want to come in with kind of a,
I'm
Already
sorry,
made.
I just last 3 years I've done a ton of research on it. so I
yeah,
kinda-
great. No, we benefit from that research, but
I
that's
just
just
had
where
my
I'm
few
at.
questions to ask. So,
I really do want to see some demographic numbers before I would want to decide the number of boards or where those communities of interest
Mhm.
are.
Yes.
Just, I think that will help the conversation for me.
Yeah. I think the exercise will have one pass at it. There's, certainly a lot of different ways and yeah, outcome is what this committee decides. And also additional information after the break and after our exercise, we're gonna do a little bit of an exercise about, temperature taking, where are we at? And that includes what other information,
Okay.
right? What other information do we think is pertinent, relevant, applicable to the context and evaluation for you? Okay, so let's take a, I don't know,
7:05.
10 or 15 minutes? How do you feel?
10.
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't need
I was gonna
15.
say that.
We have a lot to talk about. now.
Don't need 15 to pie.
10 after, this is shall be the democracy.
You need
Dog.
7:15.
She's 4.
Did you actually name your dog Democracy?
No, it's
That
Shelby the
worked.
democracy dog.
Okay.
That was, there was a hashtag going around. He went a lot of places. There may have been a motorhome involved.
How are you? Been a minute.
Yes, yes. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Hey, Ben.
Are we still?
How you doing? Good, sir. Good.
I've snuck in, but I'm gonna get behind Bill.
I ordered peaches.
So, Dina, I appreciate your